Welcome, I hope you're well. Today I'm going to be talking about how to capture amazing time-lapse photography, specifically with a Fuji camera. But if you're using another brand, the core principles will apply. However, you may need an intervalometer or look at your user manual for how the built-in time-lapse features work on your camera. Now I'm going to be taking an in-depth look at a quick and dirty way of capturing a time-lapse, then move on to a static time-lapse and then on to a more advanced motion time-lapse using a Zeppon Micro 2 slider that I've got here. For today's video I'm going to be using the Fuji X-h1 to capture the time-lapse, but the time-lapse menus are the same for the X-T2, the X-T3 and the X-T4. But with most cameras the principle will be the same, even if you're using an intervalometer. Now a sturdy tripod like this one is essential for capturing time-lapse photography, as any camera shape can ruin your end clip. And it's also worth turning any lens or camera stabilisation off as well, as the camera is going to be locked down on the tripod. A couple of other things you might want to check are that you have long exposure noise reduction turned off in your camera, and make sure your camera's auto off or power saving functions are switched off. We don't want the camera turning off at any point. We'll be using all manual settings throughout the tutorials, including white balance, to make sure nothing changes during the duration of the time-lapse. So first up, and the easiest method, is to capture time-lapse using the video mode in your camera. Now this is my least preferred method, as it gives the least amount of control. It really limits our motion blur and doesn't give us as many options for post-production. It is, however, the quickest way to set up and capture something similar to a time-lapse. So for that reason, when I simply do not have a lot of time on my hands, and it is still possible to get something fairly decent. For video, I shoot at 24 frames per second, as this gives a cinematic look when used in real time. Usually I'm shooting at 1/48 of a second for my standard video settings, as this gives the correct amount of motion blur and fits in with the 180-degree shutter angle that is used for professional videography. If required, I could reduce my shutter speed a bit further down to 1/25 of a second, which is the minimum that I can go to when shooting video, and this will give a little bit more motion blur for more of a dreamy effect. So we have our frame rate and our shutter dialed in. Now we just need to adjust the aperture and the ISO to set our exposure. If we're shooting outside during the day, then the ISO will generally be at the lowest setting. That's 200 here on the X-h1. Then I'll set my aperture to gain the correct exposure and my depth of field. So here we're f7.1, and that's giving us a nice depth of field. Next up, the frame, the composition, focus and dial in a manual white balance setting. Essentially now everything is set up in manual and nothing will change during the duration of the video. And just remember that if we're speeding the video up later in post-production, then we'll need to shoot for longer. If I speed the footage up 10 times and I want a 10-second finished clip, my real-time video length needs to be 100 seconds. For this evening though, the clouds are moving really slowly, so I'm going to shoot for 5 minutes. Shooting for longer is going to give me more choice and allow me to speed up the clip more if I need to in post-production. There's not a huge amount of detail in the clouds right behind me now. I'm going to use a circular polarizer on the front of the lens to make the clouds just pop out a little bit more. Now remember, you need to be at 90 degrees to your light source to get the polarizer to work efficiently, and for that I've got the sun actually here and I'm shooting directly behind me, so it does fit in with that 90-degree angle. Now the next step would be to simply speed up the footage in your video editing software. Now the downside to this method, apart from the post-production and shutter speed limitations, is that we're going to need to increase the speed of the clip. Now if we increase the speed of the clip, it means that frames will be dropped as we try to squeeze all of that information into a short space of time, and this can result in choppy footage as parts of the clip are discarded. Using stills photos is definitely my preferred method for capturing time-lapse photography. There are three main reasons for this. One, we have much bigger file sizes, meaning better quality images. Two, we've got more flexibility in post-production. We can edit each frame just like a photograph. And three, we have complete control over our shutter speed, frame rate and the interval, meaning we can get silky smooth motion blur. To set up for shooting stills, there is one massively important point that often gets overlooked. And it's one of the biggest causes for flickery footage, and that is our aperture. Now the aperture blades are incredibly delicate things, and they open and close at a decent amount of precision, but for the most part not precise enough to capture the exact same exposure every single time. Now every time an image is captured, the aperture blades reset and become fully open. It's only when the image is being taken that the blades close to that desired f number. Now this means that during a time lapse of many photographs, the blades will be opening and closing continuously. It's these small discrepancies in exposure that can create a flickering effect in our finished time lapse. My advice would be to choose a lens with a higher minimum f number. Lenses with a minimum aperture of f4 and above are great. When shooting wide open at f4 on this Fuji 10-24mm lens, the blades will remain open and never move throughout the entire collection of images. Another alternative would be to use a vintage lens that doesn't have an electronic aperture. So here we have my 10-24 f4 lens. Now if I shoot wide at f4, I'm getting a large depth of field providing I'm not really close to my foreground subject. So this works really well. Now the next setting to think about is ISO, and again this is always going to be my lowest possible setting. Again here I'm at ISO 200. Now this leaves shutter to complete the exposure triangle. Now the shutter speed will depend on what you're shooting and the overall look that you're trying to achieve. There's no right or wrongs here, it's more down to personal taste and experimentation. For this example of moving clouds, I'm going with a half-second exposure to get a smooth look. If the clouds are moving quick, then a quicker shutter speed might work better. If they're moving slower, 2 seconds may give a better result. It really depends on what you're shooting, how smooth you wish the time lapse to look, and how quick your moving parts are travelling within the scene. Getting some motion in each image can really make your time lapses flow smoother. Now the trade-off with a slower shutter and a wider aperture is that we are more than likely going to be overexposed. And this is where our friendly ND filter comes into play. Simply attach an ND filter to the lens to obtain the correct exposure. So here I'm using a 6-stop ND filter, and that's given me a really nice exposure for my shot behind me here. So with our framing and focus and white balance all set in manual, we now have complete manual control over the camera. Nothing is going to change during the collection of exposures. It is worth mentioning that if you're shooting at sunrise, then the exposure will be getting brighter throughout that shooting period. So you're going to need to take that into consideration when finalising your original settings. So now let's set up the interval and duration of our time lapse. So let's open the interval shooting menu, and you'll find that here. If your camera doesn't have an interval shooting menu, you're going to need to use an intervalometer, but the steps are going to be virtually the same. First, let's set our interval. Now the interval is the time between each image that's taken, and this setting will again be important for obtaining a smooth time lapse. The interval needed will depend on the speed in which the objects are moving throughout the scene. Here the clouds are moving at a decent pace, so I'm going to go for a 2-second interval. If they were super quick, then I would decrease this to 1 second. If slower, I would increase the time to say 5 seconds. Experimentation is key here. If the interval is not correct, then the footage can either look too dreamy or too choppy. It's worth mentioning that shooting at a shorter interval is better than a larger one. You can always discard frames in post-production, but you cannot add them if you didn't already capture them in the first place. So with a 2-second interval, now I need to work out the number of required frames. So here we need to work out a little bit of math. I'd like my finished time lapse to be 10 seconds long, and 24 frames per second will be my finished video output. This means I need to multiply 10 by 24 to get my required amount of frames. An easy one to work out, that's 240 still images for my 10-second clip. Now let's work out how long it's going to take to capture the whole set of images. So we have a 2-second interval and we need to take 240 images. Now that means we will need to shoot for 480 seconds. It's always worth working this out so you know how long you're going to be hanging around for. Apps such as PhotoPills have a time-lapse calculator to save you working this out, which, it comes in really handy actually. So now let's capture the time-lapse and see how it looks. So back out, completely different day, and yeah, nice and bright and sunny today. Not the best conditions, to be honest, for time-lapse photography. When I left there was lots and lots of fast moving clouds, but right now those clouds have dissipated somewhat and we're left with just the odd one rolling across the sky. Now to elevate our time lapses to another level, it's time to add in some motion. And for this I'm going to be using the awesome Zeppon Micro 2 motorized slider. Now actually I reviewed this slider a while back before I got the motorized unit for it, so if you're interested in checking that out, I'll leave a link for that video down in the description below so you can go and check out what the slider is all about. Now all of the settings are going to be the same for this moving time lapse as with the static one, apart from this time I'll be setting the slider to take the images as opposed to the camera. So essentially what we need to do is to frame up our shot. So I've got some foreground interest here, and this is going to give us a parallax effect when we will see the foreground and the background kind of moving against each other. And this looks so cool for time-lapse photography, it really does. Now for this we have to plug in a shutter release cable and set up the app for our interval and the number of frames. We also have to set up our start and end points for the slide. So let's do this first. I have to say this app is so easy to use and it works flawlessly, to be honest. First I'm going to move the slider to my start point and set my in point by clicking on the marker, and then I'm going to move to where I want the slide to end and click on the second marker, which is my end point. Now with my exposure time and interval set, the app will work out the duration, which is displayed here. Now we just need to hit go and let the time lapse start. So guys, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate you tuning in, watching the channel. And yeah, it was real fun making this little time-lapse video. Great to use a slider as well, something that's new to me. I've only been using it a few weeks and it's been great to set that up and get that going. And I'm going to be really looking forward to creating more motion time-lapses in the future. If you've got anything you want to add to this, guys, please feel free to drop a comment in the comments section below and I'll definitely get back to you. If you've got any advice or knowledge that you can share with others, that's great too. Please feel free to drop that in and share that. So guys, until next time, take care and I'll see you soon.